This is the part two of the macroeconomic policies lecture series. Now, we in our previous lecture we looked at the um, monetary policy and fiscal policy and how the policies basically work through the economy on an sort of at an introductory level. Now we will go into a little deeper, but still at an introductory level, but a little deeper into some details of how a fiscal policy influences AD, but then the influence doesn't actually live up to its expectations. In other words, the fiscal policy doesn't actually do um, good to the economy, to make it in simple words, in the sense that there is a positive effect, but then that positive effect is basically limited. And how? We will see it in this video. And then we'll also look at monetary policy and how it affects the aggregate demand. Now let's start with the fiscal policy's influence on AD and how this influence is basically limited. So we have the in this slide we have the description of the crowding out effect. Crowding out effect is related to the effect of fiscal policy on aggregate demand. Now what it says is that the remember what we did. Let me do this and give you a sort of story again, remind you the story. What we want is, so let's say this is our quantity, so this is our Y or GDP, this is our price level, and we have this long run aggregate supply. And remember, what we want is this sort of case where in simple world we would like to have aggregate supply here. So this is short run, by the way, so I'll just put AS. This is the point we would like to operate at. So we're producing quantities of goods and services that is optimal at full employment, and our short-term equilibrium is around this output level given the price level here. Now sometimes there is a short-run fluctuation, right? Remember, there is short-run fluctuation. So let's put this down here as this. So we just copied this, exactly the same thing. Long-run aggregate supply curve. Our short-run aggregate supply says is the same. So it's just a little flatter now, but it's the same curve. And our aggregate demand curve is somewhere here. It's aggregate demand curve. So it's not the aggregate demand doesn't cross the aggregate supply curve at this long-run equilibrium point where we produce YF, the optimal output. Instead, we're producing less than that. So we are way below the optimal output level. So it's like if I move that into a dynamic, time dynamic, this is time. Here it's our GDP, time dynamic graph. This is our full employment all the time. This is our fluctuations of actual GDP. We are somewhere here instead of being here for that given that time. Yeah. So we would like to. So the difference here between this is obviously the YF, and this is the Y1. So we just copied this thing here into there. So the distance here is basically this distance here. From the static graph, we move to dynamic graph. Yeah, that's what it is here. So we would like to move up to this point. So we'd like to get the economy back on the track, on this straight line. So to move the output over to this point here. And here in the static graph, it looks like moving the AD to the right, so that we move here. Oh, that killed my slides. So let's say one node. Is that one? Yeah. Luckily, this saves all the previous slides. So I wanted dotted or dashed line here. Oh no, what's happening here? Apologies. One node. So dashed line here, dashed aggregate demand that we want, aggregate demand 1. So that's what we want. It turns out our efforts to move this old AD to the new AD position may be fruitless to an extent, maybe not so successful. what we said was that government could inject cash into the economy. To do that, let me write it down. From before we said AD is basically consumption, investment plus G plus NX. So far we've been looking at this. So to do this shift to the right, government could, for example, inject 20 billion, and that would shift aggregate demand to the right as we wanted. Yeah, as we wanted. So demand, aggregate supply. This is original AD. So we'd like to shift here. So this distance here would be in. This just copied. Oh no. What's going on here with my computer today? Now it says one node is not starting normally, so let's start again. One node. No way, start normally. Why? Okay, here it is. So it's basically. Oh no. Okay, so I hope you got the. Right, let me draw it here again. So AD is basically C plus I plus G plus NX. This technology thing. Every now and then lets us down. Let's say what we want is, so I'm gonna draw here. I think I was outside the frame as well, I guess I realized. Oh, what's going on here? One node. Delete notebook cage. Okay, what's that cage? Wait, delete it just in case. What? Right, it just deleted everything. So let's see if I can get a new one. How do I open a new notebook? Draw. So recent, what do I have from loading? Okay, here it is. So let's see if I can paste all the resources I had before. Okay, here it is. Yeah, nice. So this is better. This is better. Hopefully now it will not crash. It will not crash. So I'm gonna restart again. Apologies. This is NX. So hopefully it won't crash. So this is our full employment, long run, aggregate supply, short run, and currently this is where we are, AD. What we want is move this over to the right. So somewhere here, basically, over time, I would like to get this here. So there could be successive moves, by the way, and eventually we would like to have this aggregate supply prime, aggregate demand prime curve. Now here is an example here. Now what happens here? How do we do this? And then why we said there will be crowding out effect. Crowding out effect means government may inject large sums here into the economy. G will increase, so AD shifts to the right to, say, let's say by 20 billion. That's the initial shift. And we would expect the aggregate demand shift further down to the right, but it may not be the case. It turns out when there is huge amount of money in the market, it's circulating in the economy, we will tend to demand even more money because we would expect, firms in this case, firms would like to keep more money, more cash for future investments because they would have positive sentiment, positive outlook of the economy. It's like when you give someone money, they want more money basically because they start planning for the future. So they might, and if the economy starts recovering, firms start thinking, okay, we need more money, so we need to accumulate more to invest, let's say, in a factory, because the economy expanding, there will be demand for our products, yeah? So what happens is that there is then demand for money, the increase in demand for money, I should say. The demand for money increases. So we look at now money market here. So this is the money market. In A, we have money market. In B, we have the aggregate demand and supply curve. In the money market, what happens is that because this injection into the economy increased aggregate demand, the economy starts growing. When it does, investment starts increasing. Investment is expected to increase because, you know, when the economy grows, firms start investing, opening shops and hiring more people and things like this, yeah? As investment require even more money, you know, when you want investment to grow, you want the firms to invest, and when the firms want to invest, they demand money. So as they demand money, they start asking for loans from banks. So given the supply is fixed, the money supply is fixed, as we said before, the government just fixes the money at that trillion and zillion pounds or euros and dollars in the economy. What happens is that demand just have to shift now towards, or we call it right shift. Right shift. There is a right shift at the given interest rate. There is a right shift here. But with that shift, because the supply is vertical, what happens is that the interest rate have to rise. Yeah, higher demand for money then increases the interest rate. So there is an increased rate. So this was, let's say this is 2%, could be 4% now. Yeah, given the fixed amount of money in the economy, banks will start now lending out, but then at a higher rate given the demand is higher. Yeah, given the fixed rate, fixed quantity of money by the central bank. So this Fed means Federal Reserve. It's a central bank in the USA. Right, so higher interest rate. Now what happens is that there is a negative effect of higher interest rate, unfortunately. So we looked at the effect of interest rate mechanism, transmission mechanism on economic activity in the last video series. What happened was that if the interest rate goes up now, the borrowers will now start thinking, well, this is going to be expensive to borrow now. I won't invest. So they delay their investment decisions. Consumers are affected. Think about yourself. If the interest rate is high, would you be buying home? Most likely no. Car loan? No. Credit cards? No. You will not be taking out credit cards. So consumption goes down. So with that 20 billion increase, the initial joy basically dies out because of higher interest rates. Let's say after a year of injection of 20 billion, AD is expected to shift to AD2, AD1 from AD1 to AD2. But because in that sort of 1 year in between, you know, the beginning of the injection and then the 1 year later, the interest rate rises, and AD starts now, instead of going to the right up to this point, will start, you know, moving backwards. So the initial effect will die out or will not be. So AD will not increase by the exactly 20 billion. In other words, it won't even go further increasing AD with the investment, with consumption, as we theorized last time. The idea was that there is a multiplier effect, right? So AD will keep going to the right. But it turns out it was our partial analysis. So if we look at the full picture, we should also consider the money market. Yeah, we cannot really ignore the money market. So there is also interest rate increase in the money market, which puts down the initial effect, so dampens down the initial effect. So that's the crowding out effect here. Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it's much more realistic. It's theory, but it actually happens in reality. You can do an empirical study there. Now that we looked at the fiscal policy, its effect, now let's move on to the monetary policy and its influence on AD. Excuse me. If you remember in the last week's lecture, I think we talked about why aggregate demand was downward sloping, and one reason, if I remember, was interest rate effect. Yeah, interest rate effect. Now this is, let's say, downward sloping aggregate AD. So we'll, oh, by the way, so on the left hand side we have the money market, and then on the right hand side we have the aggregate demand curve. Now let's assume that the price levels increase in the economy, inflation rises from P1 to P2. Yeah, there's some sort of, let's say, 10% increase in price levels. Let's say that's a 10% inflation. Now, with the price levels increasing in the economy, prices are rising, goods and services are more expensive. What happens? We start demanding more money. So we'd like to hold more money given the increased prices. So we need to buy the same good as we did before, we need probably 10% more money because the prices are 10% higher. So the high demand for money, given the fixed interest rates, what happens? Increases to push the money demand to the right or upwards here in this case. It moves upwards in this case. It looks like moving upwards, but it's actually the right shift because of the supply curve being vertical. So this pushing upwards or shift to the right of money demand curve leads to higher interest rates in the economy. So from, let's say, 2% now, maybe it's 4%. That's a huge rise actually for the whole economy, 2%. So doubling of interest rates is actually a huge rise. Yeah, that's the case. Now with this, with this higher interest rates, obviously then, well, firms stop investing. So remember, ED is basically consumption plus I plus G plus NX. So this investment will go down. Investment will go down because high interest rates reduce investments, to reduce borrowing. So when we say investment, it's the investment in factories, production capacity, training of employees and things like this. High interest rates means borrowing is more expensive, so investment decisions will be postponed. So that goes down. When that goes down, what happens is that usually we would expect the output to decrease as well. We would expect the output to decrease as well. So this decrease from Y1 to Y2. Yeah. So there's a movement along the demand curve upwards slowly. So this, excuse me. So this was the explanation as to why aggregate demand curve was a downward sloping curve as well. Right, so hopefully this is clear to you. This is how the monetary policy influenced the output. Now, more important one here is this one here, this slide that tells us how a government can affect aggregate demand or can shift it to the right or left by manipulating the money supply now. So we have looked at money demand so far. How about the money supply now? Right, so we have again the money market on the right, left-hand side, and then demand curve on the right-hand side. Starting with this, let's say that we are at an original or initial level of AD, so we are operating along this AD curve for a given fixed level. So this can be any, it's a given price level, P bar. Our current production is this. We would like to shift aggregate demand curve, so we can. One way of doing that so far we looked at was the fiscal policy, reducing taxes, injecting cash, or monetary policy. And if you remember from last lecture, it could be changes in interest rate or open market operations. Yeah, so open market operations, open market operations, open market operation. So central bank can implement an open market operation or undertake an open market operation. So what was it? Well, it was that the central bank can, if it wants expansion in the economy, can buy back the bonds in the market. So investors in financial market, usually individual and institutional investors, hold bonds which pay interest. So central bank might say, okay, we will buy back all our bonds. So then the investors sell the money, bonds back to this central bank. Let's say each bond is £1 billion. So basically, each bond is £1 billion means to get the certificate back from individuals, the central bank then pays each one a 1 billion. 1 billion. Yeah, each of these people or organizations in the UK get the 1 billion in cash in return for their certificates. Yeah, these bonds are let's say, were sold by central bank in the past, let's say 2 years ago. Now central bank is now buying them back. So now cash is now in the hands of these people. These are rich investors. Now what do? They don't keep the cash. They are investors, so they want to earn. So they invest this into the economy. So this money goes into AD, feeds into AD. Now this is not visible to you, right? So I'm gonna put this now here. So all this money channels into the economy and affects AD or output, right? So all this money here that has been pooled by investors goes into the economy. They don't keep the money in their bank account. Obviously they invest into bank account. The banks then lend it out. So then AD will shift to the right as a result, because banks start lending, investment increases, consumption increases. Yeah. So government is not increasing at this case because so government is not manipulating G, because we're looking at the monetary policy, not fiscal policy. Yeah. So G is not changing. Could also change NX, exports and imports. We may demand more imported goods, or we may export more by investing. Yeah. So these things change. Excuse me. So this will now shift our AD to the right. Now notice what happens now. With this operation, with this buying and selling the bonds, in this case buying the bonds back, the CB, central bank, puts more money in the hands of investors. So as you can see, the money supply shifts to the right now. So quantity of money now shifts from X1 to X2. More money will be in the hands of people now. And as a result, because the AD didn't change, money demand didn't change, we are not demanding more money. We just keep the demand line fixed here, and it's not shifting. There is a movement as a result along the downwards, yeah, along the money demand curve, which then results in the interest rates declining. So 4% interest rate, maybe 2% now. That means at the 2% then it's a low interest rate. So consumption will increase, so AD will then obviously increase or shift at the given price level. So this change here in interest rate hasn't actually affected the price level. Even if it does, aggregate demand has to still shift given the large increase at every at every price level. So there is a larger shift to the right. So economy moves to Y2 now. Economy moves to Y2 from Y1. So that's the way monetary policy influences the aggregate demand and economic activity. Yeah? So that's an interesting story, but it is actually quite realistic. Now this is what the currently I should say Americans and British are doing. They are affecting the aggregate demand by injecting more cash into the economy through money supply and many other ways. Yeah, right. Now I think this is an example here. This is an example here about the fiscal policy in the USA. This is from 2008 and 9. It's a crisis period. You may remember or not, this is about 10 years ago. We had a credit crunch, and notice that on the right hand side we have the US federal deficit, which means basically deficit is when taxes, the revenues, government revenues, are lower than G spending. Tax is the only income that government receives, or major income that government receives. G is the expenditure. So if the government basically spends more than it receives in taxes, then it will be in deficit. Yeah, it will be in a deficit. So notice this now. This is from 2007, 2008. The deficit basically widened. The reason is the looser fiscal policy. In other words, American government started borrowing more and spending more. So loose fiscal policy means G increases faster than T. Yeah, when you have expansionary, so loose fiscal policy means expansionary fiscal policy. When you're doing expansionary fiscal policy, what you want was to shift the AD to the right, remember? So So this is aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and this is our aggregate demand. In recession we are producing Y1, but we can't produce YF, so we would like to move AD to the right to this point so that we have the equilibrium right here at the YF full employment output level. Yeah, so that's the loosening, the process of this expansionary policy called loosening fiscal policy. To do this, you remember we said we can increase G, or we can also increase the money supply so that AD grows. Yeah, but we look at G right now is given the title here, so G. So there was a loose fiscal policy because we reduced the taxes, so tax revenues decreased, but then at the same time we injected more money into the economy. So that's what the U.S. government did. As you can see, the fiscal policy now increased. That large drop here, isn't it? It's about 10% of GDP. That's negative sign as well, which means T minus G was negative. But as the economy started getting on foot, the U.S. government started tightening the policy. Now notice we can shift from this graph to this graph. We can link these two graphs. This is the U.S. unemployment. This is the number of people unemployed. It starts increasing. You see, that's a sharp increase during that period. So this is 2009, but notice that when we had this increase in unemployment starting is somewhere here, actually earlier, but this started accelerating in 2007. So that's a huge increase in unemployment, which means it's a burden. It's a burden, and when people are unemployed, government will receive unemployment benefits claims. That means unemployment benefits have to be paid out for people who don't work, can work but don't work because jobs are not available. So what happened is that in 2009-ish, isn't it 9? Yeah, this fiscal stimulus kicked in, so government started implementing, as you can see here, 2009 fiscal stimulus packages, and in a short time period, economy, so aggregate demand started shifting to the right, creating more jobs. So economy started lifting itself eventually. So now employment started declining. Yeah, it came down somewhere here. So you see this is a large drop now between this point. It took some time, however. So this is a cycle, basically, business cycle. Recession, unemployment goes up. Expansion, unemployment goes down. And so it came back to normal period, yeah? It's like it's also the time when Obama left the Oval Office. So, in a way, Trump is getting some sort of credit for Obama's work. So this huge decline in unemployment was Obama's sort of policies. I guess we will see what happens with Trump's policies in about a couple of years when he either stays in the office next year or leaves office. All right, so this is an interesting story. As you can see, all this theory that we've been learning can be applied nicely into the economies. And this is kind of a doctors treating a patient. So in this case, doctors being the economists, patient being the economy, yeah? Right. Now, the last minor topic, and we actually don't need to study this in detail, is the supply side policies. Now, if you remember in the beginning, in the last lecture, well, last video, I should say, this week's videos, I said the supply side policies are long-term policies that promote long-term economic growth, policies for long-term, strategic policies. So these include, supply side policies include, investment in education, permanent lowering of taxes, or sort of any policy that basically expands long-term capacity of the economy. In other words, economy becomes more productive or efficient. So this could be the result of deregulation as well. It's much more interesting here, deregulation. Basically, deregulation means removing restrictions imposed by government from businesses. Sometimes government want to control the businesses. In some countries, that's what's happening. But removing them may help. Of course, in a short time, there's criminal activity, thefts, and economic crimes, but then eventually deregulation means businesses will be in the hands of individuals, they will make the decisions. Trade liberalization, like removing the import taxes, allowing the imported goods to freely move in on out. So investment in human capital means basically education. Investment in physical capital obviously is, you know what it is, building more factories and things like that. So these are the supply side policies. Some of them kind of are a result of fiscal policy basically. Or in other words, supply side policies basically to do something, to implement policies such that the LRS shifts to the right. Of course, SRS as well shifts to the right. So short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply shifts to the right. So that, as you can see, the name also tells you supply side. It just affects the supply curve. Of course, I think this will in between affects the demand curve as well, aggregate demand, because the wages, change in wages, or reducing labor union power will certainly affect the demand, or reducing the unemployment benefits, for example. So when you have unemployment benefits, what happens is that the people tend to be lazy. You know, once you are unemployed and you see that the government is paying you, you just tend to stay home and then consume whatever the government gives you. So if you reduce this, then it pushes the people out to work, so increase the capacity of the economy, right? Right, that's it. This is a short introduction here to this topic. But main two topics are this monetary policy and fiscal policies affecting AD. So this could be in the exam. I will shortly provide you with the details of exam content. So for now, please do the problem sets. Post your questions in the forums I have provided if you have questions, and also I'll upload the solutions to the problem sets. You can compare your answers to them.